violence and non-violence. This is from Toni Morrison's Beloved. White people believe that whatever the manners, under every dark skin was a jungle. Swift, unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood. In a way, he thought, they were right. The more coloured people spent their strength trying to convince them how gentle they were, how clever and loving, how human, the more they used themselves up to persuade whites of something Negroes believed could not be questioned. The deeper and more tangled the jungle grew inside. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought with them to this place from the other livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them, and it grew. It spread. In, through, and after life, it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it, touched them, every one, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. Meantime, the secret spread of this new kind of white folks' jungle was hidden, silent, except once in a while when you could hear its mumbling. That's the best description I've ever found of the way that harming harms the aggressor, the perpetrator, just as, but obviously very differently from how it harms the victim. And what Morrison is talking about there is the mechanism by which this happens, whereby, well, who's holding the weapon, who's being whipped, and who holds the power of life and death, and whose life is it that is held in the power of the other. And yet, these white folks live in fear, in the fear that they've planted in themselves because of their othering, their separation, and their misrecognition, their inversion of where the danger lies. So we call the victim violent, we call the victim dangerous, we call the victim unpredictable, we call the victim bestial. And then we're terrified of them. So this fear always relates to the sense of our vulnerability to the other, but also, curiously, to oneself. Both sides fear. Both sides experience vulnerability. One very realistically, one very unrealistically. Both know that they have to conduct themselves in a certain way, that danger lies if they don't do that. Harming harms the harmer no less than the harmed, or differently from the harmed. We don't live in the slave era of the United States, thank heavens. And yet this structure that Morrison identifies there is absolutely basic to the process of harming, the process of violence in our world, in our society. And of course, to imagine that that place is simply long ago and far away would be impossibly naive. But this experience of vulnerability and the fear of vulnerability is something we all live within and around. We don't want to. And we spend a lot of our time ignoring it, misrecognizing it. We can maybe look to two phases of this basic fear in our own lives. In psychology, we tend to talk a lot about the child, what it was like when I was a child. And of course, the first and most significant thing about that is our utter dependency on our carers. When we're little, we are completely dependent upon, well, we recognise our intimate and immediate carers, don't we? But obviously on a vast network of care extending outwards. That's wonderful, and when it works, it's joyous. But it's also terrifying. Turn and turn about. And when it doesn't work, obviously it's horrendous. We come to awareness of ourselves as beings by observing the other, by relating to them. And it's very clear, no matter how small we are, where this power lies, where the authority lies, where the possibility of desertion, of harming lies. And as I say, that, family life, wonderful joy. But no infant, no toddler, no child doesn't experience also this fear, this terror, which they will try and ignore. And obviously the experience of that when we're small, almost akin to death, when we displease our parents in the wrong way, or when they're just not interested, not ignore us, turn their backs on us. The potential for loss. As we grow, we become more aware of an even more comprehensive, a much more radical power of life and death, which we'll call the state in its widest sense. We learn that there are rules. We learn to play by these rules. We learn that life is potentially dangerous. We learn that this is a violent world. And it's absolutely clear at root that the state, the authority, our government, reserves the right to put us to death, to order us to kill other people, to allow ourselves to be killed by other people if it's in its interest. On a lesser level, it reserves the right to imprison us for a little time or a very long time to destroy the lives that we have. And that happens to so many. Close on 100,000 people in this country of the UK alone, and literally millions in the United States, for example. And we live in states which are, frankly, militarised. The annual arms budget of states alone is about $2,000 billion, of which $100 million goes on nuclear weapons. That's completely ignoring the $100 billion that goes on American domestic weapons every year, just people buying guns. Second Amendment in the United States enshrines the right of Americans to kill whoever in a cause. And that's before we get to the reality of the threat of nuclear war, the idea that if our government deemed it expedient, you press a button and it's the end of the world as we know it. But again, on that vast amount that is spent on weapons of all kinds, nuclear weapons in particular, that we have to keep ourselves poor, or so much poorer, in order to have the threat of killing others, in order to have the threat of ending the world. That is essential to our own survival. That is ultimately terrifying. That's the good scenario. And that's before we get on to climate change and the roles that our states do and don't play on that. And this is the present, but of course the present is always built on the past. And it seems to be only now that we're beginning to have the discussions around the role of slavery, the role of colonialism. And that's before we get on to the traditional exploitation of the agricultural labourer or the exploitation of the industrial worker. We live in societies that are frankly based on violence. Aside the joy, aside the love, aside the caring, aside the parenting, aside the friendship. But aside from that, the structure's built. And we find ourselves perpetually both in different ways, victim and perpetrator within this system. I benefit from the enslaving of millions of Africans. I benefit from the exploitation of colonialism. I benefit from the exploitation of industrial workers in this country. No two ways about it, and I'm not going to attempt to pull back from that and not be a part of this society, not share in those benefits. And yet in other ways, I'm subject to the law. If the law decides for whatever reason that I'm now outside rather than inside this protective circle of the good citizen, I could find myself in jail or worse. So we live with these terrors really permanently, partially dissociated from them. If we really owned them, if we really allowed them to be present at the front of our minds more than glimpsing them, we'd go mad, become obsessed, find ourselves martyrs for some cause or another. It's complex and it's difficult how we navigate this world, how we navigate this life into which we find ourselves born. So no wonder that we put things at a slight distance. And we have this wonderful mechanism for doing so. Dissociation, whereby we can know and not know at the same time. We can be aware and not aware. So the person who lives in a gated community and drives their SUV in and out of the gated community is both aware and not aware of the homeless trying to scratch some kind of living outside. We're all aware and not aware in different ways. We know and we don't know. And this is partly just an outgrowth of our necessity of focus in order to concentrate on the task at hand. I have to be able to put the others at a distance, but this is something more than that, and I'm calling it ignorance. Ignorance we know is one of the traditional 3 poisons of Buddhism, but this is the kind of more active version of that. Ignore ants, turning away, looking the other way, being aware and not being aware at the same time. This is what we all do, this is how we live. And in most cases it's not as extreme as those bystanders when the Jewish ghettos in Germany and Poland were being liquidated during the middle years of the Second World War. On the sound of gunfire while thousands of people were killed, and outside, perfectly reasonable, perfectly ordinary, perfectly normal German citizens went about their business, took their children to the playground, caught the tram, went to work, came home again. They knew, and they didn't know. Of course, and thank heavens, most of us never get remotely near that kind of situation any more than the slave plantations of the American South. And yet it's the same mechanism. And the other side of this mechanism, and here this too is a directly Buddhist point, it relies on the idea that we are each and always free to choose, that we are separate, autonomous, self-responsible, individual human beings. That we always have the ability to make these choices. And yet clearly our experience shows us all the time that this is, well, not true in any simple sense. And there's much talk within Buddhism and even with Zen of no self, but what we really mean by this, rather than anything mystical, is just this self that I am is not separate, it's not in control, it's not autonomous, it's not responsible. And in fact, the aim of realistic aim of our practice would be to aspire to some kind of responsibility, a relative responsibility to see the way that we interact with all the causes and conditions in the world, primarily each other, and the effects they have on that, and our striving to do what's right, our striving to do what's appropriate, our striving not to cause harm, our striving to recognise, become aware in ourselves of the harming that we do. And if I've been talking about harming on the very big scale, obviously it comes down to life as it is, as Joko Beck says, to the cross word, the evil look, the walking off and ignoring, the not listening to somebody, the not paying attention when attention was needed, was required by the situation. And all the reasons why we do that in any particular situation. Because we don't listen to children, women, lower class people, whatever. All the myriad. The way we get upset and then we don't listen. Tiny echoes of this global fear, of this global violence that we channel is a perfectly good word. The way we find ourselves in situations we don't want to be in. For many people it's working at a job they don't want to work at. Finding themselves in a relationship of non-recognition when recognizing each other is the basis of any relationship. The complexities of realities of micro-violence, micro-suffering, but very real suffering within even our relatively peaceful, relatively calm, relatively non-violent lives. So we can perhaps aspire to non-violence, aspire to the responsibility of being able to become less violent, more non-violent. I know that's put in the negative. It's even put in the negative in Sanskrit. Ahimsa, not violent. Although it's put in the negative, it's nevertheless not the simple absence of violence. It's something we can do, whether. And our first act of non-violence might be just to sit on this cushion. Might be to say the atonement gatha, the at-one-ment gatha, the gatha of non-separation. Or it might be so much more than that. If we think of non-violence then, non-violence, we're thinking Gandhi, Dr. King, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, but it's also, obviously, every time I restrain that punch, don't say that word, don't turn away if turning away is not appropriate. Each of these moments, it's almost like not rebounding, but just held, dropped dead, grounded, composted, nice metaphor we use in Qigong from time to time. Let it run into the ground, let this violence stop here. And we can aspire to have this ability to stop more. So non-violence isn't ignoring violence, it's not being nice, it's not sitting on our hands, it's not people-pleasing, and at times it can be very active. John Lewis, the American civil rights campaigner, used the wonderful phrase, good trouble, get into good trouble. How? By resisting the violence of others, by resisting discrimination, oppression, by placing oneself in a position where, well, more simply, you weren't going out and shouting at people, you weren't attacking them, you were just being in the lunch queue, being on the bus, being on the street. And then, if violence happened to you, you held it. And if violence didn't happen to you, then you were non-separate. And I've talked many times before about this idea that with the civil rights training, the really difficult thing was not experiencing that sense of separation, that sense of otherness from the policeman who was hitting you, or the perfectly nice otherwise woman who was spitting on you because you were in the wrong place where you were not supposed to be. Or after the Trouble. And let's mention the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Desmond Tutu in post-apartheid South Africa, when the task, the mission, was not to let black and white separate out entirely, and the inevitable violence that would follow from that, but to keep a sense of non-separation. And non-separation is always relationship. And if our practice is about anything, it's about this sense of non-separation, whether that's within myself, within my family, or globally. And far from perfectly, but the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was able to achieve that to a much larger degree, I think, than actually anybody expected. And there, one of the key things on their side was this concept of Ubuntu, which is a Southern African idea of, well, in actual fact, it's non-separation, it's relationship, that people are only themselves in and through their relationships with others. But in that sense, we are primary, not as being all the same, not as being uniform, but just presupposing each other, needing each other. I find myself through you. I am because you are. And in a sense, this is where the fundamental violence stops. Let's go back to that idea of myself as a separate self, as a self cut off, cutting myself out from the whole picture. That's the fundamental act of violence. And all else can follow from that, because once I'm separate from you, once I'm not connected with you, anything can happen. And if it suits me, I can enslave you. If it suits me and I can muster the physical force, I can restrain you, imprison you, whatever. But if I see myself as not separate, me with you, you with me, not the same, not one, not mystical, not identical, but not separate, then we can have relationship. We can work actively for non-violence at the micro level and the macro level. Violence and non-violence, separate or not separate.